South Korea made history by electing its first female president, but behind that historic moment lay secrets, shadows, and a friendship that would shake the nation to its core. In 2013, Park Geun-hye walked into the Blue House as South Korea's first female president, a moment that captivated the nation and drew global attention. Her victory was historic, but it was also personal. Her calm demeanor and stoic presence projected the image of a leader above the fray. What if the person shaping the presidency had no title, no office, and no public accountability? But it was that very distance from the public eye that would eventually reveal how isolated and vulnerable she was to manipulation. Journalists noticed inconsistencies in how policies were shaped and who had the president's ear. What they found was explosive. The tablet contained presidential speeches, state documents, and edits written by Choi herself, some of them before the president had even seen the materials. The evidence was undeniable. A private citizen was shaping national decisions from behind the scenes. A handful of lawmakers and media outlets began raising questions, but they were quickly dismissed or ignored. In a country where political loyalty often ran deep, few dared challenge the office of the presidency without concrete proof. Her approval ratings plummeted to below 5%, among the lowest ever recorded in South Korean history. It was a stunning fall from grace, but it wasn't over yet. The candlelight became a national symbol of hope, of democracy, and of the people's refusal to be governed by secrecy and corruption. It was a reminder that in South Korea, no one was above the law, not even the president. In segment 2, we go inside the courtroom. The impeachment trial, the high-stakes legal battle, and the shocking verdict that changed South Korean politics forever. Subscribe and stay with us. The final decision rested with the Constitutional Court, which began a months-long deliberation over whether Park's actions warranted removal from office. Calls for her impeachment grew louder, and the National Assembly had no choice but to act. She was a shadow advisor, ghostwriter of speeches, and a gatekeeper to the president herself. What began as a symbol of progress turned into a national crisis that tested the strength of South Korea's democratic institutions. Prosecutors charged Park with abuse of power, coercion, and bribery. Choi was arrested, and business leaders, including Samsung Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong, were brought in for questioning. She had access to classified documents, influence over senior appointments, and even sway over state policy, all without any official capacity. Millions of people marched across Seoul and other major cities, holding candles and demanding truth, accountability, and the president's resignation. Investigations revealed that Choi Soon-sil had used her proximity to Park to pressure major conglomerates, including tech giant Samsung, into donating millions of dollars to 2 nonprofit foundations she controlled. These funds were allegedly funneled for personal gain, including the equestrian career of Choi's daughter, lavish real estate purchases, and other luxuries. The public watched in horror as their national institutions, from the presidency to corporate boardrooms, were entangled in a web of influence peddling, nepotism, and unchecked power. It was this unusual and secretive relationship that would eventually become the centerpiece of South Korea's biggest political scandal in modern history. Choi was not a government official, not an advisor, not a politician. She was the daughter of a religious cult leader and had become Park's unofficial, emotional, and spiritual guide. Their relationship went back decades, to the aftermath of Park's mother's assassination in 1974. Choi's father, Choi Tae-min, had befriended the grieving young Park, claiming he could channel her mother's spirit and guide her through divine will. When he died, Choi Soon-sil inherited the mantle of influence. She was the daughter of Park Geun-hye, a military general who ruled South Korea for 18 years until his assassination in 1979. Her presidency represented stability, nostalgia, and a return to traditional conservative values. But 2 others, her ascent raised uncomfortable questions about dynastic politics and the influence of legacy in a modern democracy. Park Geun-hye campaigned on a platform of economic revival, anti-corruption, and national unity. But what if the real power wasn't in the Blue House at all? Behind the scenes, Park relied heavily on her longtime Choi Soon-sil, a name few South Koreans had heard before the scandal broke. In Park's adult life and eventual presidency, Choi was allegedly more than just a friend. As early as 2014, rumors began swirling about Choi Soon-sil's proximity to power. But the cracks were forming. In 2016, a team of investigative reporters from JTBC obtained a discarded tablet computer that had belonged to Choi Soon. Public outrage was immediate. South Koreans, known for their civic engagement and commitment to democracy, flooded the streets in what became known as the Candlelight protests. The scandal widened. As investigators dug deeper, a pattern emerged. The relationship between Park and Choi was not only ethically problematic but possibly criminal. Park Geun-hye, once seen as a symbol of disciplined leadership, became the face of betrayal to millions. On December 9, 2016, the South Korean parliament voted overwhelmingly to impeach Park. The protests continued through the cold winter months, with millions braving the freezing streets each weekend. Park Geun-hye's presidency once full of promise and historical significance, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked influence and the illusion of control. The scandal has erupted. The protests have begun, but the story is far from over. A sitting president, stripped of power, a courtroom watched by millions, and a verdict that would decide not just one woman's future but the soul of an entire democracy. In early 2017, South Korea was in an unprecedented state of suspense. For the first time in the country's democratic history, a sitting president had been impeached by the National Assembly, and the entire nation now turned its eyes to one institution: the Constitutional Court. Would the court uphold the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, or would it overturn the vote and reinstate her as president? This was not just a political drama, it was a legal battlefield, and the stakes could not have been higher. The Constitutional Court, 9 judges, 1 verdict. Citizens, journalists, and legal scholars followed every word, every argument, every pause. The South Korean Constitutional Court consists of 9 justices, each appointed either by the President, the National Assembly, or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But in early 2017, there were only 8 sitting judges. 1 had recently retired. That meant only 6 votes were needed to remove Park permanently from office. Instead, its job was to determine whether she had violated the Constitution and laws to a degree that justified her permanent removal from office. Inside this high court, proceedings were televised, an extraordinary step that reflected the moment's gravity. This wasn't just a trial of Park Geun-hye. It was a public referendum on how far power could stretch and who could hold it accountable. While Park Geun-hye faced multiple criminal allegations, the Constitutional Court wasn't tasked with deciding her guilt on those charges. The key accusations included: she led the panel through nearly 3 months of intense deliberation, hearings, and media scrutiny. Each testimony peeled back another layer of the presidency, revealing how Park had allegedly bypassed official channels, relying instead on Choi Soon-sil's instructions. That evidence, first revealed by journalists, was now before the nation's highest judges. Prosecutors presented damning accounts of how Park had blurred the line between state and shadow advisor, and how major business deals were influenced not by policy, but by personal loyalty, allowing Choi Soon-sil access to classified state documents, while her lawyers argued that Park had done nothing illegal and was unaware of Choi's misdeeds. The evidence pointed to complicity, or at best, gross negligence, colluding with Choi to extort money from conglomerates, especially Samsung, negligence during the 2014 Seoul ferry disaster, abuse of power and pressuring businesses. Each charge was dissected by the court, supported by witness testimony, digital evidence, and investigative reports. Their chants were unified: no one is above the law. Presiding over the trial was Acting Chief Justice Lee Jung-mi, known for her sharp legal mind and nonpartisan reputation. Witnesses included presidential aides, Blue House staffers, IT experts, and business executives. The most damning moment came when the court reviewed the JTBC tablet computer, containing presidential speech drafts annotated by Choi. They claimed Park was a victim of media manipulation and leftist conspiracy. Park Geun-hye herself refused to attend any of the hearings. Others simply stood in silence. No, history had just been made. This absence was seen by many as a sign of defiance, by others a symbol of denial. The court unanimously rules to remove President Park Geun-hye from office. It didn't help her case. Tears. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was no less charged. Just a convoy that disappeared into the cold March air. Protesters filled the streets, separated into 2 rival camps. On one side, the Candlelight movement continued its peaceful demonstrations, demanding Park's removal and prosecution. On the other, pro-Park loyalists, many of them older conservatives, carried national flags and called the impeachment a political witch hunt. As the court deliberated, tension escalated. Rumors of military intervention surfaced, though unfounded. Some feared unrest if the verdict went either way. The state alleged that Park, in collusion with Choi Soon-sil, received tens of millions of dollars in bribes from conglomerates like Samsung and Lot in exchange for government favors. Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong, de facto head of the Chaebol Empire, was accused of funneling funds to Choi's foundations in exchange for government support for a corporate merger. At exactly 11 a.m. KST, on March 10, 2017, the nation paused. Millions watched live as Chief Justice Lee Jung-mi delivered the decision. The violations of the Constitution and law by the president are grave. Gasps. Cheers. For the first time in South Korean history, a president was formally and permanently removed from office by court order. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted. In Gwanghwamun Square, Candlelight protesters wept and hugged. The aftershock, from courtroom to chaos, but not everyone accepted the verdict peacefully. In the next and final segment, we take you inside the criminal trial that shocked South Korea. A tale of bribes, betrayal, and a staggering 24-year prison sentence. That afternoon, violent clashes broke out between pro-Park supporters and police near the court. 2 people died, Dozens were injured. This was the other side of democracy. Raw, painful, and deeply divided. Meanwhile, Park Geun-hye silently exited the Blue House. No farewell speech, no apology. She returned to her private home in Seoul's Gangneum district, greeted by supporters chanting her name and laying flowers at her gate. But the legal battle was far from over. The criminal charges began with her presidential immunity lifted. Criminal prosecution resumed almost immediately. She faced 18 charges, including bribery, abuse of power, and coercion. The Samsung connection was especially damning. Though Lee was also convicted, the public focus remained on Park, a former president now facing jail time like an ordinary citizen. What began as whispers of favoritism had evolved into a judicial reckoning on corruption and unchecked executive power. The court had spoken. The president was gone. But the real reckoning was just beginning. Park's fate would now lie in the hands of criminal courts. The nation, still raw from months of protests and political scandal, prepared to watch the next chapter unfold, this time in a different courtroom. Would Park Geun-hye be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Would she spend years behind bars? Or would South Korea's institutions prove too fragile to convict one of their own? These were questions that hung heavy in the air as the trial began. If you thought impeachment was the end of Park Geun-hye's story, think again. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss segment 3. Conviction and pardon. How justice was served, then reversed, and let us know in the comments. Should world leaders face harsher consequences for abuse of power war? Do political pardons always undermine justice? She was impeached, convicted, and sentenced to decades behind bars. But just when justice seemed final, a presidential pardon rewrote the ending. When Park Geun-hye was officially removed from office in March 2017 by the unanimous decision of South Korea's Constitutional Court, the world watched with admiration. The ruling was a democratic milestone, a sitting president held accountable by legal means, through constitutional channels, in one of Asia's most advanced democracies. But for South Koreans, it was not the end of the story, it was merely the end of Act 2. In the weeks that followed her removal, prosecutors wasted no time. Her absence from the courtroom became symbolic. Former presidents still clinging to power in silence. Prosecutors presented damning evidence, including testimonies from former aides, corporate executives, and even Choi Soon-sil herself. Park was sentenced to 24 years in prison and fined 80 billion won. The courtroom was tense. Across South Korea, the nation exhaled. Park was summoned for questioning on 13 criminal charges, including abuse of power, coercion, bribery, and leaking classified information. In July 2018, the appellate court reviewed the sentence. And in 2020, the Supreme Court of South Korea upheld Park's conviction and increased her sentence to 25 years, adding more fines for other related cases. By then, Park had been convicted in 3 separate trials tied to corruption, abuse of power, and illegal use of the intelligence agency's funds. Park still had loyal supporters, primarily older conservatives and right-wing nationalists who saw her as a martyr. Weekly demonstrations outside the prison became routine. South Korea, while legally vindicated, remained socially divided. But could the court prove intent beyond the presidency? Samsung's vice chairman Lee Jae-yong was convicted and jailed, and reforms were initiated to limit corporate influence over politics. Her return re-energized far-right groups, while moderates worried about democratic back. It also reignited debates about the power of presidential pardons in South Korea, and whether justice could be overridden by political calculus. Despite the efforts, the relationship between business and government remained complex, and many critics argued that deep structural change had yet to come. She has spoken little about her time in office or in prison, choosing instead to quietly retreat to a private life in her hometown of Daegu. Story from history-making president to convict to pardoned figurehead continues to shape South Korea's evolving democracy. The official reasons cited her deteriorating health and the need for national unity amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike many deposed leaders in other countries who flee or resist arrest, Park was taken into custody on March 31, 2017. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next breakdown. And let us know in the comments, was justice truly served in the case of Park Geun-hye, and placed in a solitary detention cell in Seoul Detention Center? The most notable among them was Samsung. Prosecutors argued that Samsung paid bribes to secure government backing for a controversial merger. In exchange, Choi's daughter received elite horseback training in Germany, funded by Samsung, and millions were funneled into foundations Choi secretly controlled. She would remain there, in pre-trial detention, for nearly a year. Others were furious, believing it undercut years of civic struggle and set a dangerous precedent. Was justice truly served if those convicted of high-level corruption could walk free by executive decision? The charges were staggering: bribery from corporate giants, secret dealings through a shadow advisor, and the systematic exploitation of presidential authority. The criminal trial began in May 2017, and Park Geun-hye refused to attend most of the proceedings, claiming the process was politically motivated. At the center of the case was the collusion between Park and Choi to extract over $70 million from South Korea, as largest conglomerate. On April 6, 2018, the Seoul Central District Court delivered its verdict, guilty on 16 out of 18 charges. But the legal proceedings didn't end there. For the first time in Korean history, a democratically elected president was serving a multi-decade prison sentence. It was unprecedented, and it sent shockwaves across Asia. Yet, while many saw this as a victory for justice, some warned it could trigger long-term political instability. The scandal also forced a reckoning with South Korea's corporate giants, known as Chebe. So, when a presidential pardon was announced in December 2021, it shocked the nation. Newly elected President Moon Jae-in, despite campaigning on anti-corruption, granted Park Geun-hye a special pardon on humanitarian grounds. The reaction was mixed. Some applauded the move, seeing it as a gesture of reconciliation. In the end, Park walked out of prison after nearly 5 years. Not exonerated, not vindicated, but free. The political impact of her release was immediate. Today, Park Geun-hye remains largely out of the public eye. Her rise and fall is more than a political saga. It's a mirror reflecting a nation's struggle to define justice, leadership, and the limits of power. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to State Affairs Review for more deep dives into the rise and fall of world leaders, political institutions, and the mechanisms of power.